there, and welcome to the Abundant Self Podcast, a podcast where we talk about everything there is to learn and to know about what it truly means to have life and life in abundance. My name is Sharon Chebaibai, and thank you so much for tuning in. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is that you're tuning in to this episode. Welcome to the very first official episode of the Abundant Self Podcast. I am so excited and so happy that you're here with me today, even as we start on this journey and even as we think through about what it really means to have life and life in abundance. Thank you so much. Welcome. Feel at home. I want to believe that this is going to be something that is going to be beneficial to you, and that even as we walk this journey throughout the next few weeks, months, and hopefully years to come, that you're going to grow from this podcast, and that you're just going to feel inspired to become the absolute best version of yourself. So once again, karibuni sana. Thank you for being here on the very first episode. And what we are going to be doing today is basically setting the foundation for the podcast. That is what we are going to be doing. We are going to be talking about who Chebaibai is, what the podcast is going to be about, some of the topics that we are going to be talking about, and even how frequently we are going to be releasing this episode. So feel at home. And I'm really looking forward to also listen and hear from you. So whatever feedback that you'll have, even at the end of the episode, feel free to share it with me. I'm going to leave my phone number on the show notes, and you can also go and comment, rate us from wherever it is you get your podcasts. I'll be sharing that even as we move on with the episode. So who is Sharon Chebaibai? Well, I believe that many people who are here have been my friends or people I've known for quite some time. It's also important that you guys get to know me a little bit better. So my name is Sharon Chebaibai, and at the time of recording this episode, I have been on this beautiful green earth for 24 years, which is sometimes funny because every time I tell people I'm 24, or rather right now I'm 24, people don't believe it. I don't know. I think I look too big for my age or small. Sometimes I don't really understand. But yes, I am 24 years old right now currently, and I am a journalist by profession. And I'm now currently working as a digital media creative. So about myself and a little bit about my story. So let's see. So when I was a child, or even as growing up as a child, I had a thing for words. I loved words. I was always that child who would, when my mom said cupboard, or when my mom said an English word incorrectly, I would be the first one to correct her and be like, no, mom, that's not it. This is how you're supposed to pronounce that word. This is how you're supposed to pronounce that name, And so I had always loved language. I had always loved words. And I think even growing up now, even as I started going to school, when now I learned to write, I started writing. I think I have even talked about this on the blog, that I started writing songs. And so most of the songs, I mean, what the songs were about basically were inspirational songs, storytelling, telling a story through a song. And yes, at that time, of course, I didn't know much. So the kind of songs I was singing were based on, what was happening around me. And most of the time, even as I continued growing up, the songs that I would write about were inspirational songs, like telling people not to give up, to always have faith in God, to to be kind. As a child, I mean, at that time, there's so much little information and socialization that you have. So those are the kind of songs that I would write about. And then now, even as I got to now upper primary, now that I would see what was going on even around my family, with my nuclear and even extended family, now those are the songs I'd even write about. So I think, that is where it all began. How I think now the creative in me, I think, had started waking up and breaking out of her shell. And so when I got to high school, I think now my writing grew, or how I'd tell stories, because I'm very, very passionate about storytelling. And so as a child, it started as writing songs and speaking to people, telling stories through songs. But even as I got to high school, that broadened, and even how I tell my stories broadened. And so even still from primary, in English, how we have the compositions and how you're told, write about the day you'll never forget, And I think that is where I started exploring and trying to uncover the storyteller in me. So even when I got to high school, I'd really look forward to English, the English lesson, and for us to be told to write a composition. So I think even those who were with me in high school could tell you that people also enjoyed reading my compositions. And I don't know why it happened the way it did, but you see, for example, if the instruction for a composition is write 2 pages about maybe the day you'll never forget, or I think in high school the topics were a bit more complex, and you're told to just write 2 pages. Sometimes I just forget and even write 3 to 4 pages. And I think my composition book was one of my favorite books, because most times I'd even go back and read the stories I had written and just be amazed and just ask and just say, wow, you mean Chebaibai, this is you. This is a story you've written. And also at that time, the English teacher that I had was also very encouraging, and would also leave very encouraging comments on my notebook and stuff. So I really felt encouraged and motivated to even become a better storyteller. So in high school is when I actually wrote my very first novel. And at the time, of course, I'm a teenager, and at that time you've already started becoming interested in the opposite gender. And I think at the time, for me, I don't know if it was the same for other people, but for me, you're just thinking about, when you watch a lot of Disney animations, and you've seen the prince and the princess, and you just start getting obsessed with all that. And now you've started even watching movies, and movies these days, somehow they just like to introduce the romantic aspect into it. So I just figured, this is something that was starting to become very interesting for me at that point in my life. So I wrote my first novel, and it was a romantic book. And it's a shame that it got lost. I think about that book and I just moan and cry inside me, because I cannot believe that the very first book that I wrote got lost. And by the way, let me tell you, this book was not like those small A5 books. This was an A4 200-page exercise book that Chebaibai sat down and wrote a book and wrote a story. I wrote a story with characters, with crisis. You know how, a story, there has to be a crisis, there has to be that climax point where they try and figure out how to solve the issue. I had, each character had their own story, had their own crisis, and even how they were all coming together, culminating to this whole big story and the ending. And I remember when I was writing those books, because I wrote that one and I wrote another one again still in high school. And what used to happen was that, people never used to read that book after the ending has, after I've written the end, like if for example during prep time I've written till maybe chapter 2, the book goes round and people read, and it's like watching a series where people come and tell you, so what is going to happen next, what are you going to write about next, what is going to happen to so and so and so and so. I mean, that is when I think the storyteller in me had really come to the surface, and she was beginning to now find the kind of stories she wanted to tell. And it was good that I had those my classmates and my schoolmates around me to just read my books and just appreciate the kind of person that I was becoming. And so I think high school was when the storyteller in me really burst out of her shell. And I remember even taking part in things like drama, telling poems. I'd write poems and tell them, still write songs and sing them. So storytelling has been a huge part of me, just to say that I have always loved telling stories, because when you think about it, stories, we are stories. Like the experiences that we go through, the life that, the kind of life that happens to each and every one of us, we all have a story living inside of us. One day when we are, favored enough to see our great-grandchildren, when we'll be sitting with our great-grandchildren and telling them the things that have happened to us, telling them about COVID, maybe another pandemic would not have happened in that lifetime. But think about the stories and the things that we've gone through in our lives, the experiences, the happy moments, the sad moments. All those are stories that make the kind of people we are today. In fact, I am always of the belief that we are made of stories. Each of us is made of stories, because what has happened in my life, maybe we may have gone through something similar or the same experiences, but at the end of the day, each of us has a story to tell. And that story is going to change someone else's life. That story is going to inform how someone else experiences or tries to navigate through life. It doesn't mean that we have to, for example, when someone tells you the experience. I remember a friend of mine was using an example where when someone is walking, when you're walking and there's someone in front of you, and you immediately see that person, there was maybe a sinkhole in front of them, or just a hole or a pit, and they fall into that pit. Yeah? Does that mean that you who is behind this person will also go ahead and walk directly into that pit? Or now that there's a hole or something that you might fall into ahead of you, you choose to take a different direction? Yeah, so those are what stories, or rather are the experiences we have, do. That when you share your story or when you share your experiences, I don't have to necessarily go through the same path so that I can learn the same lesson, but I can choose to learn from what you have gone through without necessarily having gone through the same thing. Now that you know better, now it becomes easy for you to do better. But sometimes we know better and then we still don't do better. But anyway, far from that. So now I'm done with high school. Now when I went to university, when I went to campus, I remember thinking to myself, I think what was in my mind at that time was the fact that I had lost my very first book. I still have my other books with me, but the fact that I had lost that very first book, I mean, it was my first creation. And it had gotten lost just like that. I don't even know what happened. But I remember thinking to myself, so I still have stories within me that I want to tell people. I still have this desire to keep telling stories, but what do I do so that they don't get lost? And the good thing is that already, of course, at this time, there's technology, there's everything. I mean, there's ways in which you can preserve your content and your stories. And so I decided, you know what? Let me start a blog. So that's how the idea of the blog came about. For those of you who have interacted with my blog, Chebaibai Pen, that is how the blog came about. And so on the blog, we believe that every story is worth telling, every single story that you have. Sometimes we think that our stories may not have impact, or rather they are not as big as someone else's story. But imagine, you never know. Your story might seem so small in your eyes, or when you conceive it, it might seem so small and insignificant. But when you share your story with the world, or whoever it is that is around you, you'd be surprised at the kind of impact that it has. Because it doesn't matter if it's small impact or big impact. I mean, impact is impact. People will still get impacted. So every story is worth telling. That is what we believe on the blog. And that is how I started a blog. I had no idea what I would be doing on the blog, but I just started by writing stories, just short stories, fiction, poems, and writing book reviews of books I had read. And then now, as that went on, I realized I had friends around me who were doing absolutely great things, and no one was hearing their stories. So I decided, you know what, how about I just interview this person, this friend of mine, who is doing great things, who is challenging the status quo and, breaking through all barriers possible and just doing their thing. And that is how I started interviewing my friends and people around me. And at the same time, just realizing that I could use this platform as a means to educate, to empower, and to inspire my audience. And so at that time, of course, now I'm now past teenagehood, and I'm thinking about things surrounding mental health, things about depression, things about burnout, things about, asking questions like, what does it mean to be authentic? Because think about it, we go to conferences and we go to places, or when we're seated with people in workshops or whatever, and we're being encouraged to be authentic. We're being encouraged to live lives that truly matter. And then you wonder, so what does this mean? Why is it that everywhere I'm going, everyone is speaking the same language of, you need to be authentic. You need to live a life that truly matters. Mental health issues, for example, issues surrounding relationships. I mean, these are things that dominate our thinking, our minds, our interactions with other people. So how exactly do we ensure that we have the right information, or that we know exactly what these things are? And I remember on the blog, one of the main pieces that I feel was a really big challenge as well as an achievement for me, was when I wrote about depression, everything you need to know about depression. Because I remember at the time, I was not exactly at a very good point in my life. I had gone through so much prior, and I mean, reading sometimes when you're crying a lot, you know when you go online and you start reading the signs of depression, and you see what has been written, the signs and symptoms of depression, when you go to Google, or when you listen to someone saying they're depressed, and you wonder, so is this also what I'm feeling? Am I also depressed? Am I also in that state of mind? And I remember thinking to myself, if I am thinking about this, then surely someone else is also thinking about the same thing. Because sometimes it's easy to use a word to describe what you're feeling when it may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes it's easy when you're trying to describe what you're going through. It's easy to use a familiar word, a known word, and say that I think I'm depressed, and maybe you're not. And sometimes you think you're fine, and maybe you are depressed. So that is what I remember caused me to start reading about depression, and to even talk to my friend who's a psychologist, who's a counseling psychologist, and to just pick her mind, her professional mind, on, what exactly is depression? How do I know that I'm depressed? How do I know that I am not depressed? So Now, this is what now the blog started becoming about, having these conversations, asking these questions, and also getting to hear from what people have gone through and whether they agreed with it. Because I remember with depression, I got a lot of good feedback and just people talking about their experiences and even how the piece meant to them and how it shed light on something that has been bugging them also for a long time. Because right now, where we the times in which we live, issues of mental health, they're everywhere. And sometimes it's easy to get sidetracked and to not really pay attention to what a certain mental issue really means. So we just use the information that is, sometimes when information is just readily available to you, it's easy for us to misconstrue it. It's easy for us to misinterpret it for something that it isn't. So that is what the blog became about, telling people stories as well as inspiring and encouraging people and educating people and on the issues of life. So during this time, even as the blog, even as it was thriving and flourishing, I realized that many people were losing out on this information, on these stories, because let's face it, guys, not many people love reading. Not everyone has I don't know if I should call it the grace, but not everyone has the grace to sit down through a long piece of writing to just read through it. I remember thinking at the time, as a content creator, how then do how do I diversify my content? Like, now that there's this information, now that there's this impact, I believe, happening on the blog, I know there are so many people who may not necessarily, who are not naturally readers, Like myself, I love reading. I can sit down and read through a whole blog post, no matter how long it is. As long as it's something I'm interested in, I can definitely read through it. But there's someone out there who is in need of this information. Let's take, for example, the information on depression. There's someone out there who is in need of this information, but they just don't know how to sit down and read through it. And that is absolutely fine. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, so then how do I bring this information to such people? And how do I ensure that this information, these stories are reaching to as many people as possible? Yeah. So that is when the idea for the podcast sprung up. That is how it all began. And remember thinking through it, because at the time I had also started listening to podcasts. And this was back in 2018, 2019. I had started listening to podcasts. And I remember at the time, the main podcast that I was listening to was this podcast by Pastor John Piper. It's called Ask Pastor John, where people go and ask him questions concerning life, and he answers them, according to the scriptures and his sound advice as, a man of God. So at the time, and I remember I was really enjoying the content, and then I came across other podcasts like the podcast by Adele Onyango, Legally Clueless. I remember running across a podcast called Hidden Brain. Some of the podcasts that I'm listening to till today, I started discovering them at that time. And the more I listened to this podcast, the more I realized that this was also a platform that I could use to make sure that people also understood the issues of life. The same things that we were talking about on the blog, that is Chebaibai's pen, that this information could also be brought to the podcast, and it could also have equal or even more impact than we are having on the blog. And this is not to say now that the blog has been put on hold. No, it just means that now we are just using the platforms that are readily available to us to reach as many people as we possibly can, And I remember I even conducted a poll on my Instagram, and I was asking people, are you a blog person or a podcast person? And most people said podcast, which is absolutely okay, because right now, each and every one of us has different consumption needs. How we consume media is different. There are people who will enjoy reading. There are people who will enjoy being on a run and listening to a podcast, or just doing their work and, having a podcast playing on the background. There's someone who would prefer watching video content, for example, But how do we ensure that all these three different categories of people are still being met by the same message? Yeah. So that is how the idea of the podcast began. And when I decided to call it the Abundant Self Podcast, I was just reading through, I remember just going back and reading through what I had been talking about on the blog. I had been talking about issues of, mental health, issues about, for example, living an authentic life, issues surrounding starting, like right now, how do we, sometimes when you're starting something, how it can be so hard, how you can be thinking about so many things that you're scared and you fail to take on that step of action. How storytelling is important. So many issues and so many stories that I had featured on the blog. I remember thinking about how all these things are sort of, when you put them all together, they're culminating to one big idea, which is living the absolute best version of ourselves. When you think about life right now, when you think about the place that you are right now in your life, do you really think, like when you sit down and think, do you really believe that you're living a fruitful life? And what does it even mean to live a fruitful life? What does it mean when we say that we have been called to live an abundant life? As a follower of Jesus personally, I remember there's a time I was reading through the Bible and the book of John where God says, the devil came to steal, kill, and destroy, but I came that you may have life, and life in abundance, life in full. Think about it. We're always talking about how we want to live life to the fullest, but what does that even mean? What does it mean to live life to the fullest, where we're operating from the best version of ourselves? Whether it's mentally, whether it's physically, spiritually, socially, emotionally, whatever it is, our lives are made up of different facets and parts of our lives, they're different. So how do we ensure that we are living a meaningful life? If you are like me, these are questions that I'm really asking myself right now. Because truth be told, I do not want, when my time here on earth is done, what story is going to be told about Chebaibai? There's a book I read, I can't quite remember the name, but I remember, I think it was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, yes. And I remember there's a chapter where it begins by asking the reader to imagine their funeral. I believe I'm not sure if that's the book. I haven't read it in a while, but, he asks the reader to think about their funeral and what is going to be said about them on the day they die. Will it be said of me, Chebaibai, that I just lived, the average life, that I was taken to school, the best schools, I got good grades, I got a job, I started paying bills, raising a family, and then died? Because, that is what life has been reduced to. Eating, sleeping, paying bills, and dying. When you think about it. It's like a rat race where we are constantly chasing after money, chasing after all the good things in life, constantly thinking through the next meal, what is going to happen tomorrow, where are my children going to go to school, where will I get a job, I need to get the best grade so that I can get into the best high school. These are the things you're constantly thinking about, which is absolutely fine because they're part of life. But sometimes we become so focused on that we forget that there's something more that we have been put on this earth to do. Something bigger that than we can even possibly imagine. And there are so many things that are hindering us from getting there, you know? And these are the kind of conversations that we are going to be having here on the podcast. We are going to be telling stories about people who are pursuing their passions, people who are, seeking to live an abundant life. It may not necessarily be a destination right now where we are, because personally, I cannot say that I am living abundantly. That would be a lie. I cannot say that right now I'm living a fruitful life. No. But this is a journey that we can walk together. We are also going to be talking about some of the things that hinder us from, living a fruitful life. Be it, the stresses of life, depression, be it other issues of mental health, whatever it is. We are going to be tackling such topics. Today, there are so many words going around, things like manifestation. What does manifestation even mean? When people say, I'm manifesting a trip to Dubai, I'm manifesting a VW, I'm manifesting a life full of success and money and everything. What does that even mean? So those are the kind of conversations that we are going to be having here on the podcast. And if this is something that you'd be interested in, then please do share, do subscribe, follow us on whatever platform it is that you're listening to the podcast, where you get your podcast rather, so that you are always notified when we have a new episode available. Yes. So that's basically the main foundation of the podcast. And now you know how the podcast came to be. And now you know the kind of topics that we're going to be having. And so, like, for example, on the next episode, we are going to be talking about why abundance. So what is abundance? And why are we choosing to focus on abundance? Yeah, that is the topic we're going to be talking about next week. So you and I are going to be together for quite a while. In the next coming weeks, it's probably just going to be myself alone with you. But even as the podcast grows, we're going to be having guests, where we're going to be having interviews and just getting to hear from other people's stories. So if you would like to be featured on the podcast, if you have a story to tell, then you can also go ahead and reach me on my email address and my phone number. I have left those on the show notes. Go ahead and reach out to me. You can also follow us on our social media. That is at the Abundant Self _podcast on Instagram. We are currently on Instagram. And you can also check out our website. I have also left all that on the show notes. So be sure to check them out. And, try and interact with us, give us your feedback, and yes, leave us a comment or two. Let me know what you think about the main idea of the podcast so far. And are there any things that you'd like us, for example, to talk about here on the podcast? What issues are bugging you in life? I mean, what questions are you asking yourself about life right now? I mean, we may not have all the answers. I may not have all the answers. But it's always good to have these conversations together and try and figure them out together. So, like I said, you can check out our website, our social media. That is the Abundant Self _podcast on Instagram. And we are currently, for the podcast, we are currently on Google Podcasts. We are on Spotify, we are on Anchor and Pocket Casts. So, we'll be working to get the podcast distributed on other sites, but as of now, we are on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and Pocket Casts. So yes, be sure to check us out from wherever you get your podcasts. And then hopefully this is going to be something, like I said, that is going to be meaningful to you. Yeah, and like I said, I may not have all the answers. I think it's important to understand that this is not going to be me telling you how to live your life. No, because I'm not perfect. I have not figured out how to live my life personally. But I am inviting you to be part of this abundance journey, where we think through about how we can live the absolute best version of ourselves. Let me ask you a question. How does the ultimate you look like? You know, when you think about the ultimate you, how does that person look like? I mean, what are they doing? What conversations are they having? Are they pursuing their passion, their purpose? What does that version of yourself look like? What are you accomplishing? What wavelengths are you operating on? And these are the kinds of questions that we are going to seek to answer. These are the conversations that we are going to have. Because like I said, I have not attained my ultimate self. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one. When you think about the things and the person that we want to become in the next 5, 10, 20, 100 years from now, there's so many factors that are going to determine whether we become the ultimate version of ourselves or we do not become the version of ourselves that we desire. All right? And so I am inviting you today to be part of this community. As I said, the next episode, we are going to be choosing to focus on abundance. You know, what is abundance? Why are we choosing to focus on abundance? But today I was simply, I simply wanted to share my story with you so that you can get to know me, get to know who the host is. And yes, that is basically it. So thank you guys for being part of this. Thank you so much for being part of this beautiful, beautiful beginning. I believe that this is going to be a worthwhile journey. So yes, please, please, please do subscribe, do rate us. If you relate to the kind of conversations that we're going to be having, then go right ahead and, share this podcast with as many people that you can who you believe will also need this kind of information. And if you have any questions whatsoever, any comments, whether relating to this episode or even more, then be sure to reach out to me or to us. You can do that on the contact addresses that I've left on the show notes, on our social media. And I'm really, really looking forward to what we are going to be talking about in the next few weeks. Yes. And just a word of encouragement, even as I end this. If you're out there and if there's something that you've been thinking through, there's something that you've always wanted to start, this is me encouraging you to do it. Trust me, I know firsthand how scary it can be, how difficult it can be to start something, especially when there's so many people who have, started similar things before. Like me, for example, I went and just searched the word abundance on my podcast. And there are so many people talking about abundance. But what makes me different? What makes your idea different? If you need help, be sure to reach out to the people who are around you. A friend of mine the other day was encouraging me, and I remember she was telling me how it's okay to use someone else's degree. Sometimes you want to do something, but you feel maybe you're not equipped enough. Not to say that you shouldn't do your due diligence and maybe try and educate yourself on some things, but even as you grow, try and also you saying news is it's feeling a bit it's not feeling as positive as I had imagined. But yes, I mean, just employ the gifts of those who are around you as well. Employ the gifts of those who can do it. For example, if it's maybe starting a podcast and you need someone who can help you produce the podcast, go ahead. I mean, if you know someone who can do it for you, then reach out to them. Just do it. Sometimes we are always so concerned about what will people think about this thing of mine. I remember even before I even started this podcast, I was thinking, oh my God, my voice. How does my voice even sound on the other end of the headphone or earpod or whatever, the earphones of whoever is listening to this podcast? How does my voice even sound? What are people going to think about me? What are people going to think about my podcast? But all that is just going to distract you and even delay you from doing what you are meant to do, especially if it's something you're passionate about. And this is me encouraging you that you have what it takes. Yes, you are good enough. You are good enough. You can do it, whatever it is. If you need help, go ahead and ask for it. If you need encouragement, you have me. I'm rooting for you. Whatever it is that you want to do, trust me. You're never going to know how it would have happened or how it would have worked if you didn't start. Yeah? Don't focus so much on what you have right now. Focus on what is ahead. Where do you see yourself? How do you see yourself using this thing that you want to start to maybe impact the people around you? What problem are you trying to solve? Just focus on that. And I know for a fact that once you start, as scary as it may be, that along the way you're going to learn, and you're also going to get the momentum that you need to keep going, to keep doing what you love. Yes. So that is all from me. I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to be talking about why abundance, and I hope that this episode has been meaningful to you. If it has, then do go ahead and share it with as many people as you can. Until next time, bye-bye. There you have it. This has been the Abundant Self Podcast with me, Sharon Chebaibai. If this episode has been helpful to you, feel free to share it with your friends and family. We'd also love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or questions relating to today's episode, then go ahead and leave us a voice message on the hotline number in the show notes. Feel free to also rate and review us from wherever you get your podcasts. If you remember nothing else from today's episode, I hope you remember that you have been called to have life and life in abundance, and that I am rooting for you always.